Good afternoon, everyone. We're happy for all of you to join us as we look to wrap up the 2020 legislative session. And so what we're going to do today is provide a brief overview of what transpired throughout the 2020 session and answer any questions that you might have as a result. And if you haven't seen it already, we also sent out a bill summary book today, which provides further detail of the bills that passed this session, and other bills that we were specifically tracking if you have any additional questions. So today on the webinar, we have our Executive Director, Bill Peterson, myself, and Lucas Pinkin of your legislative team. So let us begin. So not shocking, mental health and disability services again rose to the top of ISAC's legislative priorities. You know, obviously the biggest issue is long-term sustainable funding for MHDS system. We were very pleased when the governor made it a priority in her condition of the state address with her Invest in Iowa Act, with a portion of that dedicated to mental health funding. Unfortunately, this original plan had to be replaced when an increase in sales tax was no longer feasible due to the financial strains placed on Iowans as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next is something that has been a long time priority for ISAC, and it was specifically funding the Iowa and Land Legacy Trust Fund. Again, we were pleased with a part of the governor's plan in the Invest in Iowa Act, with raising of the sales tax would have automatically fully funded the trust fund. But unfortunately, again, due to the political realities of trying to raise the sales tax during a pandemic, was obviously no longer feasible. And then I'll turn it over to Lucas.
Thank you, Jamie, and good afternoon, everyone. The third of our top priorities this year is a repeat top priority on the commercial industrial property tax back bill. As you know, the legislature passed a bill in 2013 that reduced the taxable valuation on commercial industrial property down to 90%, but put in place the backfill to make up for the future lost revenue to local governments. And then in 2018, we saw legislation that would either phase out or drastically reduce that funding. So we've made the case that there are one of two options if that's not fully funded, and that is raising property taxes and shifting that burden among all classes, or reducing services. Neither of those two options are something that counties are interested in, obviously. So we continue to keep this as a top priority. We were happy as the session started to see that the back bill was fully funded in the governor's proposed budget. There wasn't much discussion about it this session, but after the suspension due to the pandemic, obviously the financial landscape of the state had changed. So we were being quite vigilant, and as the session finished up, we were happy that it was once again fully funded. And that level is $152 million total, and 29 million of that goes to counties. And our fourth top priority is on weight limits on secondary roads. There was legislation passed in 2018 that would allow vehicles that are transporting materials or equipment to construction sites or from construction sites to operate on secondary roads, but using the primary road weight limit scale. And so secondary roads and bridges are not designed for heavier and heavier loads. and we found that around 3,500 bridges would need to be posted with weight limit restrictions at a great cost to the taxpayers. So we proposed legislation to undo that and ran into pretty certain terms that legislators were not willing to undo what they had just passed. And so we did have a bill drafted in 2019, brought forward again this year, but it failed to advance.
Thank you, Lucas. So obviously, we woke up in a brand new world with the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the legislature was suspended in March and then resumed back in June. And so what we did as a result of that was make some adjustments as a result. And still, though funding for Iowa's mental health and disability services region was still at the top of our list, especially because of the increased demand for mental health services as a result of the pandemic. Unfortunately, there wasn't a major investment by the Iowa legislature for mental health funding. We were pleased that at least Polk County was appropriated $5 million, but nothing else for the other mental health regions. We were very pleased that Governor Reynolds still recognized the need to infuse money into the system, and then shortly after the legislature adjourned, she announced that $30 million of the CARES Act funding, of the federal stimulus funding, would go to Iowa's mental health and disability services regions. And so how that's being allocated is on a per capita basis for all the regions. And so hopefully that money will get out soon. And basically we're waiting for how counties and regions, what those services will qualify for that funding. So we're still working on that. Next was on direct and flexible CARES Act funding to Iowa counties. Since they passed the original CARES Act, we have been waiting and waiting and waiting to see how that money would get out to local governments. Iowa counties didn't qualify for direct aid under the language in the legislation, but we have been continuing to advocate that a portion of that would go out. And so what the legislature really didn't do anything in terms of making any guidance on the CARES Act, and gave Governor Reynolds the flexibility to distribute it. And we were pleased that after the legislature adjourned, she announced that $125 million of the CARES Act would be dedicated for Iowa counties and cities for expenses associated with the COVID-19 pandemic response. And so, as you see in the bullet point, distribution and guidance are expected shortly. So I just got off the phone with the governor's office. So to give you guys an update on, in terms of timing, what is expected is that, and just to kind of give you the basic parameters, we haven't seen the specific details yet, but what we're expecting, that this announcement will be made sometime early next week. And so basically what we have heard is that this will be distributed on a per capita basis between counties and cities. And then there will be basically a cap that each county, based on that, will be allowed to apply for. So, Adams County will get so much money, Polk County will get so much money, and so forth, and be eligible for that. And so just the mechanism, they are setting up a portal through the Iowa COVID-19 website that counties will be able to submit their expenses associated with COVID-19 response. So obviously the multi-million-dollar question is, so what is eligible? And so we're waiting to see what those expenses are and guidance on how they would be submitted. So what we are expecting is a full announcement will be made early next week. And once we get any further information, we'll certainly send it out to all of you. I know there'll probably be a number of questions that all of you will have as a result of that. And so what we've done in the past throughout the COVID pandemic is set up either a webinar or a call with all the members to answer any questions. So expect that as a result. And as it's kind of ironic, as we're pushing to get the old CARES Act money out, we're also pushing for the next round, which is currently being debated in Congress. And so the biggest thing we were hoping in the original would have, direct funding for counties. Obviously, that did not happen due to the restrictions they placed on it. But we're hoping that the next round would have it go directly to counties for COVID-19 related expenses, but also now, as we're seeing the true financial impact on counties, that it would also qualify for losses in revenue. And so after we get done with our presentation, we'll hear from Mark Rotaco, the Deputy Director of Government Affairs for the National Association of Counties, to give us the latest update on what's happening on the federal level. And next we made an adjustment on this one as well. And so as we heard from many of our members concerned and first responders and so forth, having concern about liability in battling the pandemic. And so one of the things that we pushed for was for local government liability protection. And we were pleased that the legislature passed and the governor signed Senate File 2338, which provides liability protection to local government for response. And then lastly, as Lucas had talked about before, we were very pleased that the backfill was fully funded. We'll just now talk about our legislative objectives. And the very first one has to do with the county seal. And this comes from the county auditors. And so one of the unintended consequences of some other election legislation from a couple of years ago would require that there would be a county seal on all ballots. And when everyone went back into the code, well, the code language says it would have to contain the name treasurer, and it would have to have a raised seal. And so I'm sure you can all realize the added expense it would be to have a raised seal on all election ballots. And then also our county treasurers did not want to have their name on an election ballot because that's not their purview. So we were pleased with the passage of House File 2486, which takes away the requirement that treasurer be on the official county seal and that it be a raised seal. I will go on a little bit later to talk about the other provisions of the bill pertaining to elections. Next has to do with jail medical costs, and this comes from our county sheriffs, and certainly our supervisors have followed it closely as well. And this has to do with coming up with who is responsible for prisoner medical costs. And so what this sets up is that it would look to for the prisoner's medical costs to be covered first by private insurance. or Medicaid or Medicare or veterans benefits. And then if that is not covered, it provides a system of best practices on payment between the county and the medical provider. Next comes from our county sheriffs. This has been a long time priority for the county sheriffs, as we've seen a rise in the number of high-speed incidents. And so what this does, it increases the penalty for those that are going over 25 over the posted limit that results in significant injury or death. And that would increase the penalty to a felony. And with that, I'll pass it to Lucas.
All right, thank you. Certificate of the Treasurer came to us from the Treasurers Association. Previously, when the Treasurer certified that a subdivision plat was free from certified taxes and special assessments, there was no expiration date on the Certificate of the Treasurer. So we changed that so that it would expire when the county auditor delivers the new tax list to the treasurer. And certificates of title, we worked quite a bit on trying to figure out how this one would work. The idea was to do titling and registration across county lines, and our original bill would also provide for fee increases. The difficulty came with the Auto Dealers Association having some disagreements. And right as we began to make progress with the compromise bill, the legislature suspended due to the pandemic, and it simply wasn't far enough along in the process for it to get done once they resumed for that short little period in June.
Next, we're going to cover enacted legislation affecting counties. And so first is House File 2502. And it just seems, again, one of the issues, or another issue that we're battling the Iowa legislature in terms of preempting local government. And so what this bill does is bans counties from issuing a firearms ban within the courthouse unless they would be able to provide proper screening and armed personnel. So I'm sure this will be probably litigated as we look at what is sufficient screening and armed personnel. Next is on the conduct of elections. As I mentioned previously, was House File 2486, which pertains to the county seal. They added some other things pertaining to elections. And so some of the additional things that they did, that the Secretary of State would have to get approval from the Legislative Council for any emergency directives, and specifically how this affects county auditors in the conduct of elections. One of the things that the Secretary of State put in the emergency directive for the primary was extending the absentee window from 29 to 40 days, which was an auditor's legislative objective this year. So we were very pleased that the SOS did this, but not pleased by this language in this bill. And then another thing that it was added into this bill as well, that county auditors couldn't reduce a polling site by more than 35%. And so, and then also House File 2643, it took away the county auditor's ability by taking away best means available to ascertain missing information on an absentee ballot request form. And it would provide a lot of extra work for county auditors and election workers which then would be required to contact the voter directly by phone, mail, email, and then they would not be able to utilize iVoters to ascertain that missing information. Next, on mental health and disability services, there was language in House File 2643, the Omnibus Approach Bill, pertaining specifically to mental health regions, and would provide an increase in the oversight of the Department of Human Services over the regions, with again over auditing and other financial information, and then further approval of 28E agreements, and then it calls for the disbanding of the County Social Services Region. And obviously, we had some major concerns of that, specifically over local control, that if they would do that for the CSS region, why in the future might they look at other regions to do this as well? I'll turn it over to Lucas.
All right, thank you. So continuing on with enacted legislation, House File 2236 was put by our veteran service officers, and it basically says that the county recorder shall not charge for the examination or copying of records to complete VA forms for benefits. I know a lot of recorders weren't charging anyway, but this just makes sure that they are not. And in the case of the veteran service officer going in to request those records, it really doesn't make any sense to be passing funds back and forth between two county departments. So that's a good fix. And House File 2382 also came from the veteran service officers. And this relates to the confidentiality of real estate records for recipients of both the disabled veteran property tax credit and the military service property tax exemption. It makes them confidential and not subject to the open records law. This, however, does not affect individual online real estate records. So there won't be, in the assessor's office, there won't be any need to have software changes or anything like that for those individual records. It simply prohibits the release of bulk lists of those recipients. And the need for this came up because organizations, political campaigns, businesses, and perhaps the scariest, scammers, were giving these lists of disabled veterans or those receiving the tax exemption and using them for what I like to call not so wholesome endeavors. And so, this being some of our society's most vulnerable individuals, this will go a long way to protecting them and their confidentiality. Moving on to zoning bills, two preemption bills actually, and both were signed by the governor, unfortunately. First, on ag experiences, the bill prohibits the county from requiring a conditional or special use permit, exception, or variance for certain promotional or educational ag activities if the primary use of the property is ag production. So that would be things like hosting field trips or giving tours so people know where their produce comes from. They basically said you cannot require those conditional or special use permits for those activities and those properties. House File 2512 was a little more expansive and again, a direct attack on local control and local zoning. First, the bill prohibits the county from requiring an application, approval, or fee in determining if land or buildings are primarily used for ag purposes and thus would qualify for the exemption from certain zoning regulations. The problem with that is if the county does not know if a property is going to be constructing a building, for example, that could lead to problems if that property is not actually ag and they don't get the exemption and they do something that's in violation of zoning regulations. That could also cause some major problems. So very bad policy there. Also made changes for the adoption of amendments to the county's comprehensive plan, requiring that the county go through the same procedures for amendments as they do for the original comprehensive plan. And finally, the bill limits membership to both the zoning commission and the board of adjustment to just those eligible electors that reside in the unincorporated area. Previously, those in the incorporated area in the cities could serve county zoning board or board of adjustment. And so this prohibits that, which leads to a number of problems. First of all, very difficult to find qualified people, or any people really, to serve on boards and commissions. And then we also have to keep in mind the gender neutrality law that must be adhered to. Okay, moving on, a couple very large bills that got done in the final hours of session. House File 2641 was a very large state and local tax policy bill. A lot of it dealt with income tax policy, but there were several things that that will affect counties. First, it requires the county recorder to collect sales tax and pass that on to the Department of Revenue when a snowmobile or all-terrain vehicle is registered and the owner does not have satisfactory evidence that the sales tax has already been paid. It also requires the assessor, appointment of the assessor to be confirmed by the Iowa Department of Revenue before they take office. It prohibits an assessor or a deputy assessor from personally assessing property owned by either them or their immediate family. And final piece on the assessor, it requires the approval of the county attorney or the conference board to hire outside counsel for any litigation or proceedings involving the assessor or the conference board. And finally, a new license plate will be issued in Iowa. It's called Flying Our Colors. It's red, white, and blue plate with white in the middle, black letters. This will work a lot like the blackout plates that were introduced last year. There'll be an additional $10 fee on top of the normal plate issuance fee. And that would be just for your standard letter number plates. There would be an additional $5 on top of the custom plate fee for custom plates. Those additional funds will go to the flood mitigation fund, while the base fees will still go to the road use tax fund. And finally, House File 2643 was a very large appropriations bill, also had a lot of policy work. This would kind of be the equivalent of a standing bill that we've talked about in years past, where it does a lot of the budget stuff, but there's also those policy items that go in. This year was very different in that it was rushed at when they came back from suspension. They did not go through the normal process of going through all the budget subcommittees. So this bill actually did all of the general fund appropriations all in one bill. What made it a little bit easier and not a multiple 100-page bill is they put in place status quo budgeting for fiscal year 2021. By that I mean they used the fiscal year 2020 amounts unless they had certain items that they specifically pulled out to fund at either a higher or lower level. So if it was not specifically mentioned in the bill, it will go back to the fiscal year 2020 funding level. As I said before, the backfill is fully funded. In this case, it's because it was not mentioned, it's a standing limited appropriation. So as long as we don't see that in the bill, that's a good thing. That means it's fully funded. The homestead tax credit and the elderly and disabled tax credit were funded at the fiscal year 2020 level, but projections showed that there would be a shortfall, that those dollar amounts would not be enough. So there were transfers from the Taxpayer Relief Fund, $2.8 million for homestead and $2.5 million for the elderly disabled tax credit. So that should cure that shortfall and fully fund those. The bill also extends the future repeal of the standing limited appropriation for the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program, otherwise known as REAP. It was set to expire June 30th of 2021, and that was moved out to June 30th, 2023. The bill also addresses county hospitals and allows them to borrow funds either secured by hospital revenue, or they can issue non-current debt for working capital or general financing needs to sustain operations. All right. Another large part of our work up at the Capitol is fighting against legislation that is not good for counties. And we certainly see a number of those each year, and do our best to show legislators, for lack of a better phrase, the error of their ways. So we do have to oppose bills and actively make sure that they don't make it to the governor's desk. So as you can see on this list and on the next page, a number of repeating pieces of legislation that we've seen before, things like ATV use on secondary roads, nonpartisan elections, the senior homestead freeze, a number of things we see almost every year, and just make the effort to continue to fight those bills. We want to go to the next slide. Yeah, again, some of the same old ones: assessor retention vote, the senior homestead freeze, as I said before, limits on property taxes. So as Jamie said at the beginning, we did send out the bill summary book. These will all be included in there. So if you want to look those up and see exactly what's going on with those, and of course you can send us your questions at any time.
Before we answer any questions, going further, I believe we have Mark Rotaco, the Deputy Director of Government Affairs from NACO, to give us a federal update. Mark, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to talk to this group. And as Bill said, well, I'm going to give a quick update on what's going on in Washington as it relates to Congress's response to the coronavirus pandemic and the proposed next phase of coronavirus relief for our states and local governments and counties. So just to level set everyone, as you all probably heard earlier in this call, the Republican Senate leader introduced a bill called the HEALS, H-E-A-L, Act that would do lots of things to help the nation respond to COVID-19. However, many things that was important to counties was not included in this particular piece of legislation. And as you all heard, and I apologize for not being on earlier in the call, you may have already heard that this is a starting point of negotiations right now, starting today. The House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats in the White House are beginning to hash out what will be most likely the last word from this Congress on the coronavirus and the response to it. So from the National Association of Counties perspective, from NACO's perspective, of which I lead our government affairs team, what we've been saying to our federal partners on Capitol Hill is that counties need additional funding and additional flexibility of existing funding to continue to respond to this pandemic throughout the summer and through the fall and through the winter, and hopefully not farther than that as a vaccine might be on the horizon. But as we saw even in the last 2 months, or 1 month or 6 weeks, the nature of the virus changes day to day. Some places are up, and the next week they're down, and some places are down, and the next week they're up. So counties' needs for the next 10, 12, 18 months are really unknown. And it's for that reason that NACO has been sounding the alarm through really well-done research to say that counties across the country are going to need $202 billion through the next fiscal year in order to respond to this pandemic. So we were very disappointed to see that this current Senate proposal, which again is not by any means the final bill, it's just the starting point of negotiations, disappointed to see that no additional funding was included in that bill. Further, for counties, and it is a $1 trillion bill, so I could spend a lot of time talking about what else is in it, but I'll stick on this particular topic. And a particularly concerning piece, in addition to the fact that there was no additional money, there were a couple of problematic provisions specifically for counties. And those provisions, as it relates to Iowa especially, are the fact that Iowa, like many states, are likely in need of being able to use the previously allocated CARES Act to supplant lost revenue. And while the idea of supplanting lost revenue is very popular in Washington, D.C. and throughout the country, it's seen as a real need for counties. Only the bill contains the ability only to supplant 25% of CARES Act money can be used for lost revenue. In order to be able to use only the 25% for lost revenue, direct recipients of the CARES Act have to jump through many hoops. And problematically for counties is that only 25% of the CARES Act money needs to be allocated to counties and local governments before lost revenue could be used as an eligible expense. So if you were expecting, I know Iowa's about 10% right now, but if you were expecting the 45% threshold that is often talked about, this bill would only make it so 25% would have to go to local governments, which, as we all know, are on the front lines of responding to this pandemic. So in essence, it's 20% less than what most counties would be expecting. And further, there's no guarantee of any equitable distribution of that coronavirus response fund money, which came through the CARES Act, to counties. So the governor of any state could distribute that money under this proposal in any way that they saw fit. So all this to say is that NACO finds that provision really problematic. And in addition to the lack of additional funding, this hoop jumping that counties are going to have to go through in order to use CARES Act funding for lost revenue is really something that we're trying to strip out of the bill. So the last thing I'll say, and I do appreciate the time to talk about this, the last thing I'll say is that we really need your help in telling the county story to not only your congressional delegation, especially senators, but every county story. So I would really encourage you to do two things. Is one, you can contact me or contact research@maco.org to tell your particular county story as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic. You would say things like, in our county, we're seeing health expenditures up X%. We're seeing lost revenues down Y%, and for these reasons, we're really concerned about our fiscal health going forward. Those types of real stories, I think, will really move the needle in the United States Senate over the next couple of weeks. And I say the next couple of weeks because we expect that this package will be wrapped up relatively quickly. And I say quickly as it relates to the U.S. Senate, which is actually, for everyone else, very slow. But over the next 2 weeks, we have the expiration of unemployment insurance that was part of the CARES Act. We have the expiration of the federal evictions moratorium, which was put in during the CARES Act, and we have the traditional yearly August recess that members of Congress typically like to go back to their home states for. So all those deadlines that are looming will hopefully spur action in the next couple of weeks. So urgent action is needed on your part. One, to help us tell your story, and to two, use myself and my team as your legislative staff in the next couple of weeks. We have the capacity to connect you with your federal legislators, connect you with your congressional delegation, although I'm sure you don't need our help in doing that. But please use us as resources in Washington, D.C., on the ground, talking to the staff every single day to help you get what you need in this next package. So I don't know if there's time built in for questions. I'm happy to take them, but otherwise it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you.
Going with our team, have we received any questions for Mark?
We have not.
Okay, well, feel free for our members that are on to send them to us, and that we will follow up with Mark. And Mark, we certainly appreciate your time and all the work you're doing for counties, and thanks for keeping us posted.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so just wrapping things up from our presentation, are there any questions out there that folks would have?
I'm not
Jamie,
seeing.
this is
Oh, sorry.
oh, this is Rachel. We did have one question come in related to absentee voting and fraud. Could you describe some of the security measures that are in place to guarantee that who is voting is the actual voter, and kind of some of the thoughts of the auditor's affiliate on that?
Yes. So what is now allowed for a follow-up, instead of being able to utilize iVoters, they can use it to back up the information, but they can't use it to just basically fill it out when there's missing information. So as I mentioned before, they would have to contact the voter by phone, email, or mail and get a confirmation from a couple of questions. And there's a list of things that they would be able to ask to get confirmation, whether it be the mailing address, the residential address, their middle name, and the last four of their social security number. Do we have any other questions?
I think that was all that came through.
All right. Well, as Lucas said, you guys certainly aren't shy, and please continue to reach out to us with any other additional questions that you might have as a result of this session. So we're already working on the 2021 ISAC legislative priorities and all of our things that we're putting together. As you might have seen before, in July, we called for proposals. On August 7th, there is the deadline for proposals. And certainly what we encourage is to work with your own affiliate to get whatever proposals that you have to your affiliate, whether it's your affiliate president or your members that serve on the ISAC Legislative Policy Council. But obviously, feel free to send them to me as well for consideration. And so then on September 3rd, we will have the first Legislative Policy Committee meeting. Obviously, it's changed as a result of the pandemic, which we always had it held right before our annual meeting. But because of that cancellation, we will be having it virtually. And so we will certainly keep people apprised as that as it moves forward. The second meeting will be held on September 24th. And at this meeting, the LPC recommends the 2021 legislative priorities to the membership. And then in October, we will go through our online voting system again, and where ISAC voters will be able to vote on our policy statements and then vote on legislative objectives individually, and then recommend the top choices to the ISAC board for the final legislative package. And then in November, the ISAC board will accept the vote, and then we'll ultimately set the top priorities. We will send the priorities out to membership, and then in December, there will be another legislative webinar to outline our priorities, objectives, and policy statements for 2021. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rach for some other important dates for ISAC.
Thanks, Jamie. With the ISAC annual conference being canceled, we decided to move ahead with our leadership track, which was something that we were planning on holding at the annual conference. So this leadership track, as you can see, will be offered on August 26th and 27th. A notice went out earlier this week, but you can also find more information on our website, iowacounties.org. What we're going to do is have NACO come in, part of the Professional Development Academy, which they offer, and kind of offer a short series of learning that will focus on leading in times of crisis. So we encourage you to attend, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to give us a call, and we'd be happy to chat with you about it more.
All right. With that, we'll wrap up this webinar. On behalf of our entire team, we can't thank all of you enough. As we go to the Hill each and every day, or not go to the Hill, especially after this year, we can't thank you enough for the response that we have heard from all of you, especially in this pandemic time. When we send out action alerts, we certainly know it has made a difference in the final outcome of this session. While we're certainly not satisfied in the least, if there would be a theme of this session, it would be, well, we made it just a little bit better. And so again, feel free to contact us at any time. And again, we can't thank all of you enough. So thank you.